Welcome to Old Path and our study through the Old Testament. We find ourselves in the book of 2 Chronicles, and chapter 7 is kind of a part 2. If you watched last week, you'll know that what we had in chapter 6 was the beginning of what is the dedication of the temple, and there was the prayer that Solomon had made. So he ends that chapter by a number of different things that, Lord, if this takes place, will you? And it really was kind of a way of saying, knowing about human nature and how much failure there had been in the nation through the ages, and even the failure of the time that they had in the wilderness. And from that point on, he just realized that there were so many occasions, more than anyone could count, even that we have record of, that there's the real potential that this place now of formal worship could potentially be also a place where it would be obvious that they had rebelled, because God would have it fall into a place of if you will, disrepair, and that the people could be judged because of their waywardness in the spiritual sense. What we're going to look at in a little bit is something where that is precisely what God said may happen. And that it would be a real certain outcome if it came to the place where the people would be in a place of open rebellion towards God. So as we read this, we kind of already know where this is all going to be headed, because if you're any kind of a student of history, biblical history, you know that Solomon is only the third of the kings. So we understand that the first two was Saul and David. Saul was just a guy who had seen so much failure in his ministry of missing all of the potential. And David did miss some of it himself, but David was a man that was very tender-hearted towards the things of God. He was just a man who was kind of given to his passions. And in Solomon, to this point, he's really, really solid, but that means that there is still all the rest of the kings that will be coming through what is going to be after him, a divided kingdom. So we already know that history, and because we know it, we understand the things that had happened to the nation from this time going forward. But with Solomon, it was only potential. And so his prayer was, potentially, if we do this, and it creates a problem between you and us, if we will come to our senses and cry out to you and be mindful of you and this place, then will you hear? And so this is really, at this point, this is going to be God's answer back to Solomon. Now, before we get there, it's going to kind of a continuation, because this happens kind of in succession. There was a week-long festivities as far as the preparation for and the dedication of the temple, and that was a week-long thing, and then it spills over into what was the Feast of Tabernacles, another 7 days. So really, this whole time, this culmination, everything that took place, I think what we're reading when we hear about the sacrifices that were made is during that whole of that feast time, and not necessarily all in one day. But as far as the sacrificial work that went on here, it is almost unimaginable for us to try to take into our minds a full understanding of this. So there is mentioned here a mix of peace offerings, and that is where the people could partake of the meat that was being, sacrificed. And then there was also the burnt offerings, and nothing was to be consumed of that. It was to be taken and completely consumed by fire. It was an offering to the Lord. And so you can go back and look at the feasts and the different types of offerings that were made during them, and what's the difference between the burnt offering and the peace offering. And you can see the little nuances of each one of them, what they represented, and what man's participation could be in them. And so all of that is taken into account. Again, you can look at it. It's said very matter-of-factly. Before we look at the text, though, I really want to make sure that we can grasp, if you will, and fully appreciate what has been taking place and everything that leads to this time in the nation and in the history of Israel to this point. And depending on how far you want to go back, I think I'd like to start at Abraham and go back to really the promise that was given to him. And so in the broadest of the sense of the promises, it was very simply kind of a twofold thing. I'm making a covenant with you Abraham, and it's going to be, or when he made the covenant originally, technically it was Abram, and exalted father Abram, and then Abraham would be father of the multitude of the generations, is a way of putting it. So before God began to call him Abraham, or have him referred to as Abraham, the father of many, or the father of generations, he made a promise to him that was going to be twofold. It was going to be that he would have children and descendants of those children that would be numbered. There's just no way to number them. There'll be more than the multitude, the sands of the sea, stars of heaven, a couple of ways that they're described. But then also it was going to be that the people would be given by that same covenant a land that would be given to them. And so we get that in chapter 12 that begins that whole process. By chapter 15, we're told, as he reemphasizes that, God tells Abraham that his descendants are going to go into a captivity, into a slavery that was going to last for 400 years. Now, it didn't happen in Abraham's time, and it did not happen in, as far as Isaac was concerned. It wasn't until the sons of Jacob, so 3 generations after Abraham, in the 3rd generation, is when they go into that captivity. And so it's the sons of Jacob. And so it's all of what ends up happening is that 400 plus years. So there's not a lot that's told to us in the history of what happens there in that time of Egypt. It skips those hundreds of years of their captivity when we go through from Genesis into Exodus. But by the time we get to Exodus, we see that God creates for them and raises up one who would be a deliverer for them, a Moses. And in Moses, they're going to be a person, given a person who will also be the one to whom God gives the law to give to the people. And the Gospel of John picks up on this, and it really helps us in our distinction of the Old and New Testament. It says that the law was given through Moses, and everybody agrees on that. It's right there in the text. It's easy to understand. God gave the law to Moses and then to the people. But then grace and truth came to us directly from God in the person of Jesus Christ, who was God in the flesh. And that was a different covenant that was made with people, because it was a covenant that paid the price for sin. It was a covenant that was made in his blood, and it was what's able to forgive us of our sinfulness. So back to where we are in the progression, if you will. So we have the promise to Abraham that's not even realized for some roughly 500 years plus, from the time that it was first said to him until the children of Israel began to come into the land. And that would have been done through Joshua, of course. Moses never made it into the promised land. But as far as being able to lead them in, it was Joshua who led them in. He did what he did until he was taken from this earth and died in his older age. But then from that point on, there was really nobody to lead them. And then we have those several hundred years of the time of the judges. And the time of the judges, we've studied that, was really very off and on, that the people would do well, then they would be in a place of rebellion, and then there would be a place of judgment. And it was just a never-ending cycle of the ups and downs through the judges. And then you come to the point of the kings, and that really kind of fast forwards it to this time. So from the leaving at Exodus until the time that we get to the kings is roughly 500 years, just using big round figures. And it was 1,000 years from Abraham until Moses, and then leading them out. So in just big round figures, Abraham to Moses, 500 years, or the Exodus and all of that. And then from the time that they came into the land until the time of the kings, roughly another 500. It's basically a span of 1,000 years. So a huge amount of years in the making, and yet here we are, 500 years after Moses, and that temporary tabernacle in the wilderness, going from place to place in the 40 years. And even at that, once they come into the land, there's still the very transitory way that they would have their corporate worship. This is going to be a settled location for the first time, really, that they can have a focal point throughout all of Israel, of a place where they would come to. And the important part of it, when it comes to the temple, not only the plot of land where it sits, but more importantly, even the directions of what or how it was to be built. Both of those things were determined by God. And important thing to remember as well, that all of the things that would take place in that sanctuary were going to be based upon what God had shown them in the tabernacle in the wilderness. It's just an expanded, permanent, beautiful representation of what was so transitory. Now it's a settled place of their own. And that's pivotal in this, that we really genuinely understand that. Because even as they came through the time through the wilderness, it was just one place to another. It was never a fixed, settled location. And think about that too. Even from the time that they first came in with Joshua until this time, it would go from place to place. And they never really fully had a place settled, if you will, for any length of time. This now is going to be exactly that. So, little rewind of last week, chapter 6. We know that looking back on that, it was Solomon. The temple has now been built and everything is in its place. Now they're at the place of dedication. And what has already taken place before Solomon began to pray, the physical presence of God descended upon the place, and it really stopped everything that was going on. And that seems to be, first of all, the direction of Solomon's attention is paid towards that. The visible physical presence of God that could be seen. Not that it was unprecedented, but there it is at the temple. I don't know about you, but especially for the believer right here, just trying to wrap your mind around being able to see a very recognizable physical presence where God comes and dwells and interacts, if you will, among his people. We're already told in chapter 6 that the priests weren't able to do what they do. So what we get in this is that after all of this takes place, then there is, all of that happens and they're able to see it. And Solomon then turns to the people in chapter 6 as he begins to address everyone in a prayer. As he's praying to God, these are the things that he says, but the people are able to hear it. And so you can go back and look at that. Now, just briefly, because God's going to answer He's going to answer the prayer in verse 12 personally to Solomon and not in front of all of the people, but he does in the most general sense, takes all of pretty much what Solomon had requested and makes it just kind of a one big, if the things that you've laid out happen, here is what will take place. So it's God answering. What we get in the first 11 verses is, once again, the ceremonial things that took place and how God physically shows up and they're able to continue on. So with that being said, it's like the little historical bringing us up to speed on things. Let's have a look at the text and let's have a word of prayer before we do that. And we'll jump into chapter 7. Father, we pray that you would help us as we study your word to understand the importance of this and realizing this part of Israel's history is something that we can't necessarily observe with the actual looking at the places, but we do have the written record of it. We certainly know the place where all of these things would have taken place. We still see the place of contention that it is to this day. And we know, Father, that it has a great significance to you because of all the things that would have happened in this area on that plot of land. We pray, Father, that you would open our eyes to the importance of what we see in this history and how we might make proper application to our own lives by the things that are taught here in principle. We ask, Lord, that you would glorify yourself through the teaching of your word and that your Holy Spirit would lead us and guide us. We give you all thanks in Jesus' name. All right, so chapter 7 begins this way. So Solomon, when he had finished praying, then fire came down from heaven and consumed the burnt offerings and the sacrifices, and the glory of the Lord filled the temple. Let's stop for just a second. Let's look back at chapter 6. Chapter 6 says, Now Solomon spoke, the Lord said that he would dwell in a dark cloud, and I have surely built you an exalted house and a place for you to dwell in forever. So the king turned around and blessed the whole assembly. And while the assembly of Israel was still standing, he said, Blessed be the God of Israel, who has fulfilled with his hands what he spoke by his mouth to my father David. Now remember, just before this, before he begins any of this address into chapter 5, look at what we see there. And it came to pass, verse 13, when the trumpeters and the singers were as one to make a sound to be heard, praising and thanksgiving to the Lord, when they lifted up their voice to the trumpets and the cymbals and the instruments of music, and the praise of the Lord, they said, for he is good, and his mercy endures forever, that the house of the Lord was filled with a cloud, and so the priests could not minister because of the cloud and of the glory that had filled the house of God. Now, there is a couple of ways that you can look at this. That chapter 7 is reestablishing what had already taken place at the end of chapter 5, and that it's just that they're talking about the same event. Or there's another view that the glory of God had descended upon the place and everything kind of came to a stop, and then Solomon has his address. But in chapter 7, you see a repeat of what we see at the end of chapter 5, but with the addition that there is now sacrifices that are being consumed. So it would appear as though before Solomon addresses that God shows up in the visible sense, and it is what makes the people say what they say, and then he is just taken by the whole thing, and he says what he says in those first verses. So then he begins that prayer. We studied it again, chapter 6 last week. I believe at this point in chapter 7 that it's not as though God's glory had departed because Solomon then at that point began to pray and address all of these things. And in response, as I see it here, that God only amplifies what has already been taking place, because now the offerings that had been made were going to be taken and consumed. Now, meanwhile, God has heard his prayer. Now he's going to address him directly, but look at what we see in the beginning again of chapter 7. And so it says, just like before, the priest could not enter the house of the Lord because the glory of the Lord filled the Lord's house. And when all the children of Israel saw how the fire came down, the glory of the Lord on the temple, they bowed their faces to the ground on the pavement. They worshipped and they praised the Lord, saying, for he is good, for his mercy endures forever, which was being said before. So it's a repeat of those things, I believe. Now the people are now joining into it, aside from just the people that were the formal worship people that are mentioned in chapter 5. So, verse 4. So the king and all of the people offered sacrifices before the Lord. So it's not just the king, but the people did as well. So this is why you would see the huge number of animals that were actually offered as offerings. In addition to just what Solomon has here, the people had began to offer as well. So Solomon offered a sacrifice of 22,000 bulls, 120,000 sheep. So the king and all the people dedicated the house of the Lord. And so it gives the impression that the people were to offer, but he was bringing about the livestock for them to do so. And so there's a participation of both involved in this. So the priests attended to their services, the Levites also with their instruments of music of the Lord, which King David had made for the praise of the Lord, saying, for his mercy endures forever. And whenever David offered praise by their ministry, the priests sounded trumpets opposite them while all Israel stood still. So something that they were familiar with. And this was, again, done in David's time. Now here it is Solomon's time, and there is that simple repeated refrain that they had even during David's time. Furthermore, Solomon consecrated the middle of the court that was in front of the house of the Lord, for there he offered burnt offerings and the fat of the peace offerings. That's where you find out the two different offerings that were going on. And because the bronze altar which Solomon had made was not able to receive the burnt offerings and the grain offerings and the fat. And this simply means that there was just no way that the amount of sacrifice happening in this spans of time was so far beyond what it was able to accommodate under normal circumstances that they used the outer portion just outside of the actual temple in order to do this, to accommodate for this particular offering. So it says, at that time Solomon kept the feast for 7 days, and all of Israel with him, with very great assembly, from the entrance of Hamath to the brook of Egypt. And so this is like beyond what is today's borders of Israel and all the way up into what is modern Lebanon. And the brook here is Sihon, which is to the kind of the southern extreme of the land of Israel into the land of Egypt. So this is just a fancy way of saying it's almost like a Dan to Beersheba thing, but it was kept, and everybody that was of the tribes was to come, and this was the people who came from all those links and all those places. So on the 8th day, they held a sacred assembly, for they observed the dedication of the altar for 7 days, and then the feast for 7 days, which would be tabernacles. So this was all done to coincide one with another. The dedication of the temple came first. At the close of that was the beginning of Feast of Tabernacles, a 7-day observance, which they had been doing. God had them doing this for quite some time. And then it says, now on the 23rd day of the 7th month, he sent all of the people away to their tents, joyful and glad of heart for the good that the Lord had done for David, for Solomon, and for his people. Thus Solomon finished the house of the Lord and the king's house, and Solomon successfully accomplished all that came into his heart, and to make in the house of the Lord and of his own house. Now, you can go and see the parallels in 1 Kings chapters 8 and 9 of this. Now, there are some variations. If you took them and did them completely side by side, there are differences in them, not differences like one says one thing and one says another. It's just differences as far as the amount of detail that are given in the two narratives. If you put them together, you have, again, the composite. And we get this a lot in Scripture, that if you take the events of each person writing, if they overlap, it's best to take them all together. They'll be complementary and they'll add detail to give you a fuller picture of it. But what we get here is very interesting in the reply that's given to Solomon. So when Solomon prays this prayer of dedication, and if it tells us that God has heard the prayer and he answers him, then it's, as we see here, then the Lord appeared to him. So again, questioning, when did the Lord appear to him? Did he appear to him right after he had prayed this, or was it after he sent everyone home? Like if what we're getting in verse 12 is chronologically after verse 11, this would have been when he sends everybody home. So whenever it was that he heard this, the important part of it is that he had a number of things that he requested of God, and God's going to answer him. Now, let's remember something else too. It's not the first time that God has come directly to him and directly interacted with him. Because if you remember, when actually early on, God had asked him, what would you have me to give to you? And his answer was, I'm not David, and I don't know how to do what he did. And so would you give me the ability? Again, this is one of those places where if you look at 1 Kings, and then you look at what we see when it was here represented to us as well, he had prayed for wisdom and for knowledge and for the ability to lead the people. And so God gives that to him, as we've already studied in this. Where we have chapter 7 here is God's reply to his request. Let's look real quick. In chapter 6, as we go through that, it starts at verse 22. Yeah, it starts at verse 22 of chapter 6. And this is the request that he makes. First of all, it is if people take an oath. If one person has sinned against another, and that oath is to repay the debt, that kind of a thing, then would you... It's basically asking for God to mediate instead of leaving it to the priests. Verse 24, that if we're defeated in battle. Verse 26 is if there's drought that comes in. And so he makes all of these specific requests of God, and we'll see how God answers those. The fourth of them was any number of offenses, and they're found in verse 28. So notice what he says. When there's famine, if there's pestilence, blight, mildew, locusts, grasshoppers, enemies besiege the land and the cities, and whatever plague, whatever sickness. That's just a very broad way of whenever these things happen. It's Solomon's recognition that those kind of things will happen as a way of getting people's attention, and that God would let those things happen and fall into place, but for the simple way of making sure that the people understand what's brought them about in the first place. That's really what's in operation here. So then we see in verse 32, it's the prayer of the people that would be foreigners. They're not among your people. So if they come here and if they pray, would you listen and would you hear? Verse 34, if we're going to be going to war and we come to you before we go to war and seek your favor, would you show us then favor? And then there is the time if they would go into captivity, verse 36. If that's the case and we go into captivity, if we will turn to you like Daniel did. We read about that last week, and Daniel would have opened his windows, and prayed towards Jerusalem, understanding what Solomon had asked for and how God answered that prayer. What we get from verse 12 on is God answering Solomon for what he has prayed, but he doesn't do it in a point by point, but some of the points are actually mentioned, and you can see that it's directly a way of answering it in the most general of senses without all of the detail. God just says, if you guys are rebellious and this is what ends up happening, then if you will turn your heart, and he gives it just as a very simple, if you will, kind of a recipe. But it is also one of those verses that is, I think, so often and horribly misunderstood, and more importantly, it's horribly misapplied. That's the problem with it. So let's go ahead and look at it. Verse 12 tells us that, so the Lord appeared to Solomon by night, and this doesn't say how exactly it was. Was it done through angel of the Lord? Was it done in a dream or a vision? That doesn't really get a lot of discussion. And so he said to him, I have heard your prayer, and I have chosen this place for myself as a house of sacrifice. Okay, great. This is God saying, I've chosen this place. So we've already studied this. It's not as though Solomon just said, where's the best place to go? And how do I want to build this? None of that stuff was left to chance. God is the one who put these things in place. And as we look back early on, even when it was back to David's time, what is the significance of Mount Moriah? And what is the significance of Jerusalem and Zion and those different words that you hear thrown around? Well, if we believe that they are one and the same, and I think there's good reason to believe that this is the case, we believe that beginning with Abraham, this would have been the location where Abraham was looking to and would have followed through with the sacrificing of Isaac. And the reason, if no other reason, it would make perfect sense that a father would be willing to give his only son as a sacrifice to God, or as a sacrifice for what God had required of him. And this only begotten son, as good as dead, was spared from being put to death and have it be a permanent thing. The situation with Abraham and Isaac is incredibly imperfect compared to the perfect of when the Father offered his only begotten, who did actually suffer death but was resurrected from the dead. But the idea of a father sacrificing the son of his love, if that carries through, it makes perfect sense that would be where Abraham would have looked to offer Isaac. And then what we know of this place here would be the very place of the tabernacle, or of the temple, I should say, there at Jerusalem. And then down the road from that time of the kings to the time of Jesus, that Jesus would give his own life there in this same basic area and right on that same part of Jerusalem, all within walking distance. It all would have taken place at the same time, or it would have all happened in the same place, So the significance of this place is incredibly important, and it's chosen by God. So here, the location, all the way back to David, the threshing floor of Ornan, was something shown to David, and David was given the details about how to create it and how to construct it. That was passed along to Solomon. It's finally come full circle, and so here's where God answers him. And this is a place that I have chosen to be a place for myself, and it will be a house of sacrifice. So again, we do know for sure where Solomon would have built the temple, the area. We also know that that's where Jesus would have offered himself for the sin of mankind. So for God to say that this will be a place of sacrifice that I have chosen, that would be for the temple, and it would be a place for his people, but it would ultimately be the place for all of mankind where a sacrifice would take place, that being the person of Jesus. That's the important part. Now, here's the answer to his question. The first part is verse 12, because Solomon had said, would you accept this place and would you make this your own? God answers that question. Second part, when I shut up heaven and there is no rain, or if I command the locusts to devour the land, or if I send pestilence among my people. So remember, that's already the things that he had mentioned earlier on. Now, the problem for any pestilence, any locust, any of those kind of things would be judgment matters. If they're defeated in battle, the reason for it would be the same way. It's because God is not showing them favor in battle, though he promised that he would, but he conditioned it on keep your lives right before me. If you're going to expect for me to do these things on your behalf, there needs to be a reciprocal relationship. It's not going to be a one-sided thing. And if they fall into these kind of problems, and if they fall into judgment, that will not be because God's fickle. That will be because they willfully disobeyed him. So that's the important part of this. Now, verse 14 is one of those places that is so horribly misapplied by people. And I did it earlier in my ministry and earlier in Bible teaching and things like that, because I never really made sure that I didn't notice at the time that it should be only understood directly to whom it was being said. And then the bigger picture is only understood if we look at the individual details of what are being said here. So let me work through this with you because I think it's very, very important. We've all seen the bumper stickers on this. We've all seen the different shirts with it on the same thing. People will wear the shirts, and here's what it is. If my people who are called by my name will humble themselves, if they will pray, if they will seek my face, and if they will turn from their wicked ways, then I will hear from heaven and I will forgive their sin and I will heal their land. So remember, this is all conditioned on these two first verses that are part of this, verses 12 and verses 13. So verse 12 is where he says, I'm going to make this a place of sacrifice. It's chosen by me for that purpose. And then he says in verse 13, now, if I have to enter into a place of judgment because of all of the reasons that you have just said in chapter 6, Solomon, if that's the case, and you fall under my hand of judgment, then here is the only remedy for that. So, judgment is implied. That's A. So he says, if that's the case, and here's the qualifier, if my people who are called by my name will humble themselves. Let's just deal with the people who are called by my name. My people, those who are called by my name. For the people that would wear the shirts, have the bumper stickers, have the coffee mugs, whatever it may be from 2 Chronicles 7:14, it implies two things. It is my people. So when he says here, my people called by my name. Okay, great. So who is that and who does it specifically speak of? Well, God has one covenant people in the way of, like there would be a temple under the law, everything that we see being said here. So the people that are being spoken of are the children of Israel. This is said to the king of the children of Israel. And so these are the people who are called by his name. So for those people in our country that might make this about America, we have a real problem here. Because America is not his people any more than any other country on the planet. And it is also not made by his name. So he never made a covenant with George Washington as he did with Abraham. The two things are completely different. So as far as a covenant people and a covenant land, God only put one of those in force in all of human history, and that would be the children of Israel. Now, the reply to that would be, well, then we do know that the people who are called by his name and who are his people would be the church. And so they feel that that's the way in to make this about something, in expanding it over what is said to Israel. Israel's the only one who actually fits all the criteria here, but people would say, well, if we make application to it, we can't make it necessarily about America because America doesn't qualify. So then they move it towards the church. That creates a secondary problem because look at what else is said. So then if my people will pray, if they will seek my face, that's good. The church should do that. But remember, this is implying that they are under judgment. Now, people might look at our country and say that our country is under judgment, and I honestly couldn't argue against that because I see what's happening around the country, and I don't see God's hand on this nation as it once was. But for maybe him still preserving some within the church, it's a pretty messed up place compared to what it was. And the world in particular, but the United States is very much in rebellion against him for the most part. So with that being said, if we're going to try to make this about the church and say that if they will pray and seek his face, notice what it says, that they have to turn from their wicked ways. Remember, it's their wickedness that has created the judgment that has already been spoken of not only by Solomon, but also by God. So if they will do all of those things, a nation can do that. But if we're saying that this is about the church and the church needs to turn from its wickedness, that is a real problem. And so the Christian, if they're walking rightly before the Lord today, so not perfect, but if our fellowship is right before the Lord, and whenever there might be something that we know that the Lord doesn't approve of, it creates grief in our hearts. We come before him, we acknowledge that, and he restores our fellowship. We're never unsaved, but God will say, look, you've got to acknowledge that. There's a problem here between us. And then the person is able to say, God, you already know what I would have done. You already know what I have done. I just simply acknowledge it, and I seek that you would just forgive and cleanse me. Well, that's the promise that's there with the believer, but that doesn't mean that we're in a place of wickedness to the point where God's actively judging us. So again, you can't make this about the United States, and you can't make it about the church because it doesn't fit. So it doesn't work for the nation because the nation is not a covenant people. The United States of America has been incredibly blessed by God. I have no question about that. But I do not see the United States as any kind of a covenant people. The only covenant people that there are is the nation of Israel, which is still in place, and then a covenant was made with the church, and that was made in the blood of Jesus, and the church is comprised of both Jew and Gentile alike. So that's all very easy for us to understand. So if his people, this is speaking directly of the children of Israel, and that's the only people that this can actually apply to. If my people will pray, and they will, if they will first of all humble themselves, if they will pray, if they will seek my face, if they will turn from their wickedness or their wicked ways, then at that point, only then, I will hear from heaven, and I will forgive their sin, and I will heal their land. So that's the promise of all of the things that Solomon had asked him for. If this potential, and so what God answers him back is, of all of the potential things that you have addressed me about, Solomon, if the nation falls into any of those things that would be judgments, then I'll tell you this, if my people who are under judgment at that point, if they will humble themselves, that means basically come to the point of recognizing I'm the only one to blame for the problem here. That's a humility. That's humbling themselves. If they will humble themselves, pray, that's seeking his remedy. And if they will turn from that wickedness, if they will seek the Lord and turn from their wickedness, those two things are running in opposite directions. If they'll do all of those things, then the promise is, I'll heal them of their sin, or I'll forgive them of their sin, and then I will deal with all of the problems that are happening in the land. The plague, the pestilence, the mold, the mildew, the locusts, all of that stuff, the enemies, the people that are coming in and oppressing them. If all of those things are happening all at once, there's the remedy. The people have to be in a place of humility and humbleness, being willing to say, what we have done has caused this, and we own up to it, if you will. That's the humbling. And then the other things, the praying, the seeking his face, and the turning from the wicked things that caused it in the first place. If all of those things are met, and again, it's not God up there with a checklist. He knows the hearts of man. He knows whether there's a sincerity. If they see their trouble and they come before the Lord and say, you're not to blame, we're to blame. And so we're going to quit doing what we're doing, which is taking our eyes off of you, and we will turn our eyes towards you. If that's the case, that is the prayer that is part of it. We're going to beseech the Lord, and we're going to ask for these things, and then we're going to seek him and turn from those wicked things. Then he's right there to embrace them and restore them. We see that through their history over and over and over again. Now, last thing I'll say on this. In principle, the idea of a person, can an individual person, even if they know what they're supposed to do and they understand what God wants of them, Can they fall into things that would make God, or get God to the place where he would say, don't expect my favor, and now you're going to have to deal with the consequences of your wickedness, and it's going to be horrible. If a person at that point says, I realize what God requires of me, I have been rebellious against him, and I have not wanted to do what he's asked me to do, and I've brought all of this judgment upon myself. If that individual is able to come before the Lord and say, I humbly acknowledge what I've done, and I am going to pray, I'm going to turn from my wickedness, I'm going to seek after you, I'm going to seek your face to know what it is that you would want of me, then expect that God would say, great, I'm going to forgive you of your sin, and I'm going to heal the calamity that has fallen upon your life. Will there still be some consequences? Sure, possibly. But at least as far as the person is concerned, they can know that they have, once again, the fellowship with God restored, and they can be forgiven, and they can be cleansed, and they can have the awareness that things are right between they and the Lord. If that's how we want to try to take this, that's in God's nature. But remember that aside from Israel, there is no national repentance that God requires of a nation, especially in these times, because now that idea of repentance is between God and man on the individual level because of Jesus. So grace is not something for a nation. Grace is for the individual. Will God sometimes show a gracious hand towards a nation? If they're really faithful to him, and I think that at times in our nation's history we have been far more so than at the current times that we are, but we've never been perfect. But I can only look at the other nations of the world and say we have had, to this point, we've had a great deal of I guess you could say, favor and prosperity in this nation that we never really earned. And I think that it was given to us, granted by God. So that's what I will deal with on verse 14. Now, verse 15, where God says, now my eyes will be open and my ears will be attentive to prayer made in this place. So that is for you people and even the foreigners that he had mentioned. Now that's going to be the place. Notice what he says in verse 16. Now, let me do them together. I'm sorry. Don't want to lose the gravity of what's being said. Verse 15. Now, my eyes will be open, my ears will be attentive to prayer made in this place. So again, remember, God is only making good on what he said he was going to do in the first place. God would not have them build a temple and a place for worship and a place for prayer and a place for fellowship with him if he had no intentions of showing up in the first place. So God says, here's how it is right here and right now. He's already addressed what will happen if it ever isn't so, where they've so abandoned him that he removes his favor and his presence on the nation. But for now, he says, my eyes will be open, my ears attentive to prayer made in this place. For now I have chosen and sanctified this house, that my name may be there forever, and that my eyes and my heart will be there perpetually. So, for now, the way that things are, I'm going to inhabit this place. I can be found here. This is where everything will be as it's supposed to be. Fast forward to Jesus' time, and think about what it had turned into. And when he had gotten there and they'd found out, he had seen rather, that it was just made into a thing of merchandise. And he turned over the tables and all the rest, and he says, you've made this, what was supposed to be a house of prayer, you've turned it into a den of thieves. You've just made it into a marketplace where you can extort the people and take from them. So that just shows where it had come. And really at that point, you can say, yeah, their nation was being completely judged, though the leadership didn't see it. But think about it, from the time that they began to fail as a nation, first beginning with the northern tribes being taken away by the Assyrians, and then ultimately being conquered by the Babylonians and Nebuchadnezzar. And really from the successive generations after that, the Medo-Persians had a say in who came back and what they would do. And they still had their governors from foreign nations. That turned into the Greeks, and at Jesus' time, the Romans. So they were not a free people. They had a place, they had a history, they had a backstory, but the idea that they were governed directly by God and that they were autonomous and that God gave them their own land that they could govern themselves, not since, pretty much, not since Nebuchadnezzar took it out, just figure in round figures about 600 years before Jesus. From that time on, they were not really sovereign in their country as far as their leadership. They are now, which I find very, very intriguing and very important for our days. But for 1900 years, they were displaced. After Jesus had died, before the first century was out, they were kind of cast out of the land. And so brought back up in the middle of the last century, that we know. So again, verse 16, for now I have chosen this place. Now, we also know this, that because at this point, not too long down the road, they were going to have the prophets that would come during the time of the kings, and they were going to be speaking about things that are still future to our time, and how much of a focus Israel and Jerusalem in particular are going to figure into events that are still future to our day. And so God's way of saying, my eyes will be there perpetually. Think about it, that the Father knows that that's when he, at that point, would appoint the Son to come and walk among us, and that he would give his life in this place. Not right at the temple, outside of the city, if you remember, but that's not far. Outside of the city from the temple, not very far at all. In fact, when we go to Israel, we walk that, and it's not a very far walk. If you're doing it on a dead run, let's say, you could be in the city at around the area where the temple would have been, and you could be out of the city if you had a direct route with nobody in front of you. You could be out of the city in a matter of minutes. So it's that close in proximity. So with all of that said, now look at what he says, as for you, so you, Solomon, as for you, if you walk before me as your father David walked, and you do according to all that I have commanded you, and if you keep my statutes and my judgments, then I will establish the throne of your kingdom, as I covenanted with David your father, saying, you shall not fail to have a man as ruler in all of Israel. And we know that there's a couple of places where this is really kind of looking at that. Let's go ahead and take a look first at, let's go to 2 Samuel. I know I've done this before, but it's worth looking. Chapter 7. And this was where David wanted to build the temple, and Nathan had told him, you can go ahead and do it. And, God's going to obviously back it. He backs everything that you do. And God had to say to Nathan, don't tell him that. Go back and tell him something else. I'm not going to have him be the one to build it. Here's how it's going to go. Verse 12, Nathan comes and says, when your days are fulfilled and you rest with your fathers, this is Nathan speaking for God, I will set up your seed after you, who will come from your body, and I will establish his kingdom. He will build a house for my name, and I will establish the throne of his kingdom forever. I will be his father, and he will be my son. And if he commits iniquity, I will chasten him with the rod of men and with the blows of the sons of men. But then you can read on from it. But that promise was really a kind of a near fulfillment, was the person of Solomon. If we want to look for its perfect fulfillment, we don't find it until Jesus is going to once again rule and reign as the King of Kings and the Lord of Lords, future to our time, Revelation 19, and into the millennial kingdom and the forever one after that. So that's all still very much future. Now turn to 1 Kings chapter 11, and we'll find out when this actually went bad. Remember, by this time God has answered him and promised that he was going to do all these wonderful things through him, that God was going to give him wisdom and knowledge and understanding like no one's ever had before. And as far as riches and the things that he would have in the material sense, once again, he would not have a rival in that. And that's what made it possible for him to build the nation that he did, and the temple and his house and all the things that were there. This is, if you will, the pinnacle of what it was like in the life between David to Solomon, and the nation itself had seen an era of prosperity as it had never seen before. And remember, by the time Solomon's gone, that would never be the same, because the nation would never be consolidated as one people any longer. The north was going to go through a series of horrible kings and ultimately be taken by the Assyrians, and really never occupying the land as the tribes again. But look at what we see. Where did it all go south for Solomon? King Solomon, verse 1 of chapter 11 in 1 Kings. Solomon loved many foreign women, as well as the daughter of Pharaoh, women of the Moabites, of the Ammonites, of the Edomites, the Sidonians, and the Hittites. all of these people are ones who God says, do not ever intermingle with them. Why? Because they will turn your hearts from me to their gods. That was the caution to them all the way at the beginning. So, from the nations of whom, that's what we read right here, the Lord had said to the children of Israel, you shall not intermarry with them, nor shall you, nor they with you. Surely they will turn away your hearts after their gods. And Solomon clung to those in love, and he had 700 wives, princesses, and 300 concubines, and his wives turned away his heart. There's the problem. Just as God said. Now, that would be an internal problem for Solomon, but it was going to really set in motion by the time that he dies and his son Rehoboam takes over. Rehoboam has not seen a man who is solely and completely devoted to the Lord as he should be, and what he sees is a man who is compromised, terribly compromised. So the Solomon that we read about in 1 Kings 11 is very different from the Solomon that we read here, in whether it's 1 Kings 8, 9, or 2 Chronicles 6 and 7, a completely different man. So going from that place of God showing favor and giving him the ability to do the things that he did, now he's in what seems to be short order, begins to have, if you have everything given to you the way that he did, you tend to take your eyes off of the prize, and that is walking rightly before God. Now instead, he intermarries with hundreds of people, or has them as wives, concubines, just a number that's almost staggering to remember. How many people do we know in our lives that we know by name? 1,000? Let alone have them see you as husband, or they have nobody outside of you. It just shows you how bad things had become. And of course, they turned his heart away. And we do know he got it together at the end of his life. Read Ecclesiastes, and you read the writings of a man who was so frustrated because of his folly in the middle part of his life. After everything had been handed to him, he took his eyes off the prize. That's a danger. So, verse 18. So then he says, then I will establish the throne of your kingdom as I covenanted with David your father, and I said, you shall not fail to have a man as ruler in Israel. But, now here's again the contingency, but if, important, but if, so you'll have all of these things, but it's not all one-sided. But if you turn away from and forsake my statutes, my commandments, which I have set before you, and you will go and serve other gods, and you will worship them, then I will uproot them. Not just you, but the nation's going to have to deal with it as well. Because as the king goes, the people are going to go as well. And they went because Solomon made provision for his wives to have their places of corporate worship, and from what we read in 1 Kings, he participated in those things. So there's the caution. All of it is a potential of blessing and right fellowship. However, if you will, and what this basically says, if you will rebel against me, you're going to lead the nation that way. The nation will follow you. As they follow David, they're going to follow you into that folly. And we see it happens. It's just historical fact. We see that it took place exactly as was the warning. But it's important that we see this in verse 19. But if you turn away, and this is that idea of the statutes, the commandments that I have set before you, and you serve those other gods, then I'm going to uproot them. This nation is going to have to suffer for it. From my land, which I have given them. And this house, which is sanctified for my name, I will cast it out of my sight. I will make it a proverb and a byword among the people. We'll get to proverb and bywords in just a moment. But let's remember that this promise that this is what he would have happen happened on two occasions. Solomon's temple was destroyed. And of course, during Zerubbabel, a very inferior one was put back in place, but it was still nonetheless a place of corporate worship. And then before Jesus, a century or two before Jesus, they began the construction through Herod on a new temple. And it was, once again, one of those grand places, but it was ultimately also destroyed. So the place of corporate worship for the nation was destroyed because they had fallen into a place of rebellion against God. He gave them over into the hands of their enemies because of their wickedness. So this beautiful place that was made at the direction of God, in the place where God wanted it, became something that was a prize for Nebuchadnezzar to plunder and to destroy. And also, same thing for what the Romans ended up doing to the temple that Herod had built for them. Once again, they were no longer able to even have a place of corporate worship. As corrupt as it was, they were displaced yet again from the land. So here God is telling them, it's not really as God would know it, obviously the history and how things were going to go, it was going to happen to them repeatedly. And as far as the temple and the plundering of Jerusalem, there would be two very major ones that are still future, where God doesn't say it's not going to happen. He just says it will happen if you allow this to take place. And it happened exactly as he has warned them. So once again, man is without excuse, as was the nation of Israel. Now, he says, I'm going to uproot them. And this idea of a proverb and a byword. A proverb, think of what Solomon did in the Proverbs, is to just say things that we would say are wisdom, but they can be short, direct. They have a cutting bit to them. Sometimes even sounds a little bit sarcastic. But when people look at the destruction of this place and the uprooting of the people, it will serve as a proverb. Because remember how many times Solomon would say, the wise man does this, but the foolish man does that. The wise man gets this kind of favor, the foolish man comes to ruin. Those are very short, direct, pointed, easy to understand, kind of, if they had walked with the Lord, they'd still be there. Because they rejected him, that's why it's in this kind of a state. And so the idea of a byword is, again, it's just sharp and it's cutting, but it's intended to illustrate a point. So when people look at it and they would say, how is this possible? He goes on to explain what that will sound like at verse 21. As far as this house is concerned, what is exalted, everyone who passes by it will be astonished, and they will say, why has the Lord done thus to this land and to this house? People will look at it and say, wait a minute, if this was the place that Solomon had dedicated and the Lord's presence came upon it and literally consumed the offerings, fire came down and consumed the offerings, like what happened with Elijah's time, how did it get into this kind of a condition? Now, interestingly enough, to some extent, we get that same kind of, I personally do, get that same kind of a feeling when I'm walking there in Jerusalem and I'm looking at the Temple Mount. And I see the devout, and they're at the western wall, and they're praying, and you see them all throughout the city, and you really ultimately realize Israel have control of that part of Jerusalem. They really have control of the whole country. In a military sense, they don't have to have people occupying their land in the West Bank or in Gaza, but they allow them to live there. But they ultimately have the ability to take any of that land at will. But they're not willing to go to war in that. But what we need to really recognize from this, when it comes to the land itself, and I look at that, I just go, yeah, they control it, but for wanting to avoid the political and really what would become an open warfare, they allow things to take place, but it's not the way that God had intended it. Because remember, at this point, there wouldn't have been a place for pagans to come and to do the things that they do. And yeah, the things happening on the Temple Mount is paganism. And so it's not the God of Israel that is being worshipped there, and it is not the God of Scripture that's being worshipped there. His people, the Lord's people, are there, and again, there's a gathering of them back together because of what's coming future. But the bottom line to it, they have autonomy as a nation. They don't answer to other governments if they don't want to. They have the ability of self-determination entirely right now in their hands, and it's the first time that they've had that in 2,500 years plus. But they have it for now, though it's very uneasy, and they still allow a lot of compromise for fear of what would happen if they didn't. But as I look at it, I just think, though they have what they haven't had in 2,500 years, it's still a far cry from what they had at Solomon's time. And really the only explanation as to why it has gone into that condition, they have forsaken him in the way that they at one time had their relationship with him. It had changed immensely. So then verse 22. Then, if they do this, let's just read verse 21. And as for this house, which is exalted, everyone who passes by it will be astonished, and they will say, why has the Lord done this? Thus to this? Why has God done this to the land? Why has he done this to the house? And then they will answer, well, here's why. Because they forsook the Lord God of their fathers, the one who brought them out of the land of Egypt, that was their bondage, and embraced other gods, and they worshipped them and served them. Therefore, he has brought all of this calamity upon them. So that is the recognition of the God who loved his people, sent them a deliverer, gave them the law, led them through the time in the wilderness, gave them a place of formal worship, gave them peace, gave them a king, and gave them enormous prosperity like had never been seen before. But it falls into a place of such horrible disrepair. Now, how could that possibly be? Well, because they had forsaken him. And remember what's being said here, that the one that they say that has forsaken them is the Lord who has brought them out of their captivity or their bondage. Let this be a reminder as I close here. If we think of in the figurative sense, the church itself has been broken from the bondage of sin as well. We've been taken from the slavery that we had towards sin, and we never want to get to the place of looking at the God who has delivered us and freed us from that and take any of it for granted. At all times, no matter how good, or even if we're in a place of faltering, we want to get to the place of saying, you're the God that I know who has taken me from the slavery that I had towards sin, and you have set me free. You've taken me from my bondage. Let me walk in a place of freedom before you by simply enjoying and accepting and walking in the forgiveness that you offer to me. Staying in that place of fellowship and open to him, and that there is the relationship that goes on between God and his creation. And again, it's all based upon this. Have we been able to make peace with God because of the work of Jesus Christ? Have we looked to him and accepted his gift and his offering of himself for the forgiveness of our sin? And if all of that has taken place, we can come to God at any time. When we fail, we come to him, recognizing, owning that failure, and just acknowledging and accepting the restoration that he offers to us for that. So if we get to the place where we reject those things and don't care about it, you see what's happened with the people of Israel. They were his people. They were his chosen, and they chose to rebel against him, and they had to deal with the consequences. We see it to this day. We have the benefits of 3,000 years of hindsight to see how God has interacted with his people over 3 millennia. And it helps us in our understanding of how he does what he does, why he does it, and the warnings that he gives so that he will avoid those things. And yet man still does what they do. It's an amazing thing. Well, all that said, we will get into chapters 8 and 9, and it's just now Solomon begins to settle into that ease of life that begins to be such a trap for him, which we'll see as we look through these next chapters. We'll pick it up there next week. And again, I know the chapter 7:14 thing becomes really controversial. If you have any questions about it, or if you'd like to jump into it a little bit further, I'm sure you've heard plenty of other things said where they make it about the United States or even about the church. And if that hasn't been helpful, or if it's in any way unclear, then contact me through the email, and that is at oldpaththeology.net. And I look forward to talking with you about it and conversing either by mail or email or however. So anyway, until next week, we'll pick up at chapter 8 and probably get into 9 next week, and we'll work our way through the book of 2 Chronicles. Till then, I pray that God blesses you as you pursue him through his word.